When the internet began, bulletin board services, or BBS, became the first online communities of the so-called information superhighway. Using their phone lines, people logged in from all over America to talk about sports, games, movies, and on one BBS in particular, share their ghost stories. Over time, those communities all went dark, except for one lone server that continues to operate somewhere in an unknown part of Pennsylvania's Rust Belt. A relic of the 1990s, veiled in mystery, it is a digital archive of humanity's strangest encounters with the unknown, as told by the people who experienced them. My name is Brandon Schexnayder, and you are listening to Fear Daily.
Subject: The Root. User: Big Mama Drama. Posted May 11th, 1997.
The fever started behind my eyes, a slow, gathering heat that spread like someone had lit a match inside my skull. By the second day, I couldn't tell whether the walls were bending toward me or I was bending toward them. My skin felt too tight. My jaw ached in a way that had nothing to do with infection. Nothing like anything I'd ever seen in the dental office. The gums along my lower molars swelled so badly they pushed my lips outward. When I pressed inside of my cheek with my tongue, I could feel something shifting that wasn't supposed to move. On the morning of the third day, one of my teeth slid loose in my mouth as gently as a bead slipping off a string. There was no pain, just a slick, wet give, and then it sat there on my tongue, foreign and heavy. I spit it into my palm and studied it under the bathroom light. The root was gone. Not broken, gone. The bottom was hollowed out like something had crawled into the tooth from beneath and eaten its way upward. By afternoon, 2 more teeth had followed. My jaw throbbed with a deep, rhythmic pulse that made my vision jitter. When I tilted my head, I could hear a faint clicking from somewhere inside the bone, followed by a soft, tearing sound that reminded me of wet gauze being pulled apart. My fever soaked through every towel I pressed against my forehead. My daughters hovered outside the bathroom door, whispering nervously, but I sent them away. There was nothing I could let them see. Not now, not when the inside of my mouth felt like a garden for things that didn't belong in the human body. This all began 6 days earlier, in a brightly lit room that smelled of bubblegum fluoride and disinfectant. I'd been a dental assistant for almost 8 years, long enough to fall into a rhythm, long enough to know that the worst bites usually come from toddlers or anxious adults who'd convinced themselves the chair was a medieval torture device. But that morning, my schedule had looked routine. Extractions, fillings, cleanings, a couple of new patients. Nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing that should have changed the course of my life. He came in just before lunch. Small for his age, maybe 8 or 9, pale. He didn't speak much, just stared at the floor and held his mother's hand like he was bracing for something. His chart mentioned sensitivity in his molars, possible abscesses. He moved slowly, each step deliberate. When I guided him into the chair, his body tensed as though he were resisting an invisible current pulling him backward. The doctor stepped out for a moment to grab something from the supply closet, leaving me to prep the exam. I slipped on fresh gloves, adjusted the overhead lamp, and asked him to open his mouth. He obeyed, but something in the gesture felt wrong. His jaw didn't hinge like a normal jaw. It opened too smoothly, too wide, like there were fewer tendons limiting its motion. Inside, his gums were colorless, not pale pink, but a washed-out gray that made the teeth look too bright. And near the back molars, I noticed little ridges along the gum line. Not sores, not swelling. Ridges, as if gums were growing new layers beneath the surface. I leaned closer, and that was when he bit me. Not a startled nip, not a panicked clamp, a deliberate, sudden lunge upward that buried his teeth deep into the pad of my left hand. I felt each point sink in with eerie precision. The bite wasn't the worst part, though. It was the sensation that followed. As he released me, something warm and slick slid beneath the skin of my palm, threading through the puncture as though the bite had been a gateway. I jerked back and nearly tripped over the stool. Blood welled from the marks. My fingers tingled. The boy closed his mouth and settled back into the chair as if nothing had happened, but his eyes, dark and unblinking, followed me the whole way to the sink. I washed the wound. It stung sharply, then went numb. When the doctor returned, I hid my hand behind my back. Shame, confusion, fear, none of it made sense yet, but I felt an instinctive urge to conceal what had happened. For the rest of the day, the punctures in my palm throbbed with a strange heat. That night, after my daughters went to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table and pressed around the wounds. The skin felt wrong, thicker, almost rubbery. When I squeezed slightly, a thin thread of clear fluid oozed out. Not pus exactly, but something viscous, almost shimmering. I should have gone to the emergency room. I knew that. But there were bills to pay, shifts to cover, daughters to raise. I convinced myself it was just an infection, just a bite, nothing more. I iced it, swallowed ibuprofen, and tried to ignore the faint tapping sensation crawling across my palm as though something inside the tissue was repositioning itself. 2 days later, the fever arrived. It came in waves, rising without warning, leaving me dizzy and drenched. My joints ached in rhythms that didn't match my pulse. When I pressed a hand to my cheek, the bone beneath felt subtly reshaped, like clay someone had pushed their thumb into. The mirror became my enemy. I caught glimpses of swelling in places that had no reason to swell. The underside of my tongue, the hinge of my jaw, the roof of my mouth where something bulged gently downward like a bubble forming. On the fourth night, I woke to the taste of blood. My tongue grazed the empty space where a molar had been hours earlier. I spat the tooth into the sink and watched it rattle around the porcelain bowl, hollow again, cleanly cored. The fever surged so hot that the air shimmered around the bathroom light. My vision swirled. Behind my lower gum line, something pushed outward, stretching the tissue with slow, determined pressure. I pressed ice against my cheek, and it hissed. Actually hissed, as if the heat beneath my skin was alive and protesting the cold. When I pulled the ice pack away, the swelling pulsed once, then resumed its slow, relentless explosion. By the fifth day, I could barely swallow. A pressure had accumulated behind my front teeth, a growing wedge that had forced them slightly outward. When I ran my tongue across them, I felt a series of sharp ridges forming along the gum line, too symmetrical to be swelling, too deliberate to be natural growth. The realization arrived quietly, without panic. These were not human teeth pushing upward. They were something else, something gestating in the bone, threading through the roots of the teeth I had lost, anchoring themselves deeper each hour. I tried to hide the worst of it from my daughters, but they noticed the way I covered my mouth with my sleeve, the way I flinched when they hugged me, how I avoided eating anything solid. They hovered uncertainly, instinct telling them something was deeply wrong, but loyalty telling them to pretend otherwise. I wanted to reassure them to stand upright and look steady, but each movement sent tremors of heat across my jaw. The swelling radiated outward like branches forming beneath my skin. On the sixth night, I couldn't lie still. The pressure had grown unbearable. Every inch of my mouth felt crowded with movement, wet, soft clicking from deep inside the bone, gentle tearing along the gums. I leaned over the bathroom sink and opened my mouth as wide as the pain allowed, and the mirror reflected a landscape I did not recognize. My gums had split along the molar line, opening like a seam. Beneath the torn edges, pale shapes pushed through, curved, glistening, not shaped like any human tooth, too long, too thin, tapering to points that pulsed faintly with each surge of fever. My jawbone had expanded outward, creating room for these new intruders. The bone itself looked porous, as though bored through from the inside. I braced my hands on the counter. More teeth, if they could even be called teeth, pressed upward with a steady insistence. Whatever the boy had carried inside him had passed into me through the bite. Not venom, not infection, a seed, a beginning, and now it was finishing its work.
Subject, substitute teacher. User, you are next 123. Posted, November 12, 1996.
I was 16 the year the substitute showed up. Junior year, fall semester, the time when the school still smelled like pencil shavings and floor wax, and everyone pretended they weren't already burned out. The football team was undefeated for once, and I was just trying to stay invisible, keeping my head down, keeping things simple. But that was before everything shifted, before I realized someone in that building had been watching us far longer than any adult should. He appeared on a Tuesday morning with no announcement. He was simply standing in front of the whiteboard when we walked in, wearing a tan sweater and slacks that didn't fit quite right, like he'd borrowed them from someone taller. No one had heard anything about Mrs. Callahan being out, yet he stood there calmly with his hands clasped, head tilted slightly, eyes already fixed on each of us as though he knew us personally. And maybe he did. When he took attendance, he never looked at the sheet. He named each student correctly, but not just the names printed neatly on the roster. He used our nicknames, the ones our friends used under the bleachers or scribbled onto lockers in permanent marker. He even used mine, a nickname I hadn't gone by since elementary school, the one only my father ever used before he left. I tried to tell myself he must have overheard someone in the hall, that there were reasonable explanations, that substitutes sometimes taught siblings, but the unease settled deep and refused to move. He didn't teach much that first day. He spent most of the period writing strange, fragmented phrases across the board and looping cursive, thoughts that didn't connect, half memories, lines that felt like they belonged to someone's journal. Only one stuck with me. Not everyone who leaves does so by choice. At the time, I assumed it was some literary theme he wanted us to unpack. Much later, when I found the same phrase printed in the margins of a decades-old yearbook beneath the photograph of a student who died before graduation, the unease sharpened into something much, much colder. The next day, he rearranged the desks without explanation. He'd done it between classes, shifting each desk an inch here, 2 inches there. It looked random until I noticed the students' positions. He'd seated us in an order that matched our private tragedies. Kids with dead siblings. Kids with absent parents. Kids whose homes had burned down. Kids whose secrets lived in whispers. I watched him glide through the classroom like someone sorting artifacts in a museum, and something inside me recoiled. I tried to avoid his gaze, but every time he looked in my direction, the air felt heavier, as if something unseen was leaning across my shoulder. One afternoon, I saw him standing unnervingly close to a hallway bulletin board filled with yellowing photographs from past decades. At the center of the collage was a faded 1960s class photo. He was staring at it with quiet intensity, and when I looked closer, my stomach twisted so sharply I had to grip the wall. He was in the photograph. Same face, same posture, same slight tilt of his head. Even the sweater looked like an earlier version of the one he wore now, and he stood directly behind a girl who had died in a car accident during her senior year. I clung to denial. Maybe it was a relative. Maybe a coincidence, maybe stress was playing tricks. I would have believed anything else, if not for what happened the next week. Rain hammered the windows that afternoon, turning the view outside into smears of gray. The substitute paced slowly along the aisles, hands folded behind him, pausing occasionally behind a student to observe their work. When he stopped at my desk, the temperature around me seemed to drop. A heavy pressure like deep water wrapped around my ribs. He lingered long enough for panic to bloom, and when he finally moved on, I saw a slip of paper sitting on my notebook. The handwriting was mine, every crooked slant, every tight loop, yet I had not written it. A single sentence read, "You are next." My fingers stiffened and my breath thinned. I stared straight ahead and didn't look at him for the rest of the class. That night, I dug through our attic for my mother's old yearbooks. I spent hours flipping through them, searching every group photo, club page, and senior spread. He appeared in all of them. Always the same, always in the back row, always beside or behind students who died young. He never aged, his clothes barely changed, his expression stayed frozen in that mild, unreadable calm. My denial collapsed into something raw and shaking. The next morning, I didn't go to school. I sat in my bedroom with the blinds drawn, the air thick and still, trying to convince myself I was imagining patterns and static. Around noon, a car pulled into the driveway. A school faculty sedan, the one used for administrative visits. I didn't need to look to know who was inside. His footsteps approached the porch, slow, deliberate, each one placed with the same quiet precision he used in the classroom. A soft thump followed. Something slid beneath the front door. I waited until the footsteps faded completely. When I finally retrieved the envelope from the floor, it contained only a single sheet. Our class roster. Every name was crossed out except mine. The next day, he was gone. But not just absent, erased. The administration insisted Miss Callahan had never taken leave. They said there had been no substitute in that class at all. No one in the office had any record of him, no paperwork, no payroll entry, no emergency contact, nothing. They treated my questions like signs of stress, the ramblings of an overwhelmed, crazy student. But the desks remained arranged exactly as he had placed them, and in the newest class photo taken later that year, if you stare long enough at the back row, a faint figure stands behind the students, out of focus, blending into the cinderblock wall, wearing a tan sweater that looks both too old and too familiar. Even now, years later, whenever roll call is taken in a quiet room, I sometimes feel a presence standing just behind my shoulder, listening, counting, marking something down with patient precision. I used to think he was haunting our school, and now I think he was never haunting anything at all. He was simply tracking what was his. He wasn't teaching, he was taking attendance.
Fear Daily is an independent podcast hosted by Brandon Schexnayder and written by Brennan Storr, with Joanna Smith serving as the consulting editor, audio production by Rachel Boyd, and sound design by Southern Gothic Media. This podcast is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to real events or locations, is entirely coincidental. Ad-free versions of Fear Daily are available now on your favorite podcast apps. For more information, visit feardaily.com. But move fast, before the server goes offline.